Speaker, $400 million worth of goods and services travel across the Ambassador Bridge each and every day. Auto parts, fruits and vegetables, medicine. It is the largest border crossing in North America, 25% of all trade between Canada and the United States. The blockade is putting thousands of jobs at risk, Mr. Speaker. Auto workers are on shutdown. Yep. Parts manufacturers are closing down. Right. Farmers cannot get their goods to market. More than goods, Mr. Speaker, the blockade impacts cross-border nurses and truckers who don't get paid if they don't deliver. This is hitting jobs, workers, and our supply chains that stock grocery stores from Windsor to Quebec. My community's message to the protesters: end this blockade today. My question to the Leader of the Opposition: when will the Conservatives stop pandering to the protesters and start standing up for workers of this country? Hear, hear.
For 2 years, Canadians have been living with COVID-19 restrictions. Restrictions on travel, restrictions on visiting loved ones, restrictions on worshiping, children restricted from playing with other children or taking part in sports and other activities. 2 years of isolation that has inflamed Canada's mental health crisis and hurt our most vulnerable populations. Canadians just want their lives back. The Prime Minister needs to stop using the pandemic to wedge, divide, and stigmatize Canadians for his own political gain. It needs to stop. Conservatives are calling on the Liberal government to follow the evidence, follow the science, and table a plan to quickly end all federal mandates and restrictions. Canadians deserve a plan on how they're going to get their lives back, and it's time that the Prime Minister delivers that plan.
Mr. Speaker, what started with a message from truckers has turned into a cry from Canadians from across this country. They've had enough lockdowns and restrictions, enough mandates and job losses, enough of this government's overreach. Canadians want their lives and their freedoms back. Conservatives have heard the message. We will take up that fight and will continue standing up until all the federal mandates and lockdowns have ended. So the time has come for the blockades, like those of my riding at Coots, to come to an end. The Liberals have damaged our lives and our economy enough. Let's not cause further harm. It's time for the Liberals to stop politicizing this pandemic, stop wedging, dividing, and stigmatizing Canadians. Follow the science, follow the current advice from experts, follow many other countries in the leadership of some provinces, end the mandates and restrictions. Today, the government has an opportunity to provide a clear plan for reopening our country, as Canadians deserve. The only question is, will the Prime Minister and his government give them one? Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians across the country are saying enough is enough. Every day, new protests spring up here in Canada and around the globe. Today, we are facing the 4th day of a blockade at the Windsor-Detroit Bridge, the busiest border crossing in North America. 450 million in goods cross the border every day, Mr. Speaker. A prolonged closure will continue to cripple our economy. We need the Windsor-Detroit border to reopen, not today, not weeks from now. Canadians want their voices to be heard, Mr. Speaker. Meanwhile, our Prime Minister doubles down. 2 Liberals are calling him out for his divisive rhetoric and for using the pandemic for political gain. These protests and the consequences fall squarely on the Prime Minister's lap. After 2 weeks of dithering, the solution will not be simple. The Prime Minister must accept to meet with all leaders on Parliament Hill and find solutions to end the COVID mandates, end the blockades of our critical border infrastructure, and restore peace, order, and good government. Why won't the Prime Minister listen?
Oral questions. Question orale, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, it's been almost 2 weeks since the beginning of this impasse. We all want the protests to end and these Canadians to feel like they've been heard and respected. But now critical infrastructure is being restricted. Why? Because of this Prime Minister's failure. I've asked the Prime Minister to meet with me and the other opposition leaders in good faith to try to find a way forward from this impasse. He didn't answer yesterday. He hasn't answered to date. I'm going to ask him again. Will he meet with us?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative Party of Canada has spent the last 2 weeks endorsing and enabling these blockades across the country. The leader of the Conservative Party and her team have been their biggest champions, even promoting their fundraising. The consequences of these actions are having dire impacts. They're impacting trade, they're hurting jobs, they're threatening our economy, and they're obstructing our communities. I am focused on ending it. I hope the Leader of the Opposition will maintain her current position and continue to call for an end to these blockades.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Continues to blame others for things that he's responsible for. Today, he actually has a chance to do something for Canadians. We have a motion before this House that would tell the government to let Canadians know when they are going to end these restrictions. 2 years into this pandemic, and given the current circumstances, it's not an unreasonable request. Canadians deserve a Prime Minister who's willing to follow science and lift the restrictions. Even his own Liberal MPs agree with us. So a simple question for the Prime Minister. Will he and his fellow Liberal members of Parliament support our motion that is on the floor today?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, everyone in this country is sick and tired of lockdowns and, quite frankly, of COVID-19. But Canadians also know that the way through this pandemic is by listening to science, is by following public health advice, and indeed by getting vaccinated. That is what we have been focused on from the very beginning, and that's why we're continuing to encourage Canadians to please get vaccinated. About 61,000 Canadians got their first dose just last week. We need more people to continue to step up, get vaccinated, get their kids vaccinated, get the booster shot. That's how we stay safe. That's how we support our frontline health workers.
The Leader of the Opposition.
So I have a question for the Prime Minister, because he's talking about vaccinations. We all support vaccines, and 90%, as he has said, 90% of Canadians have been vaccinated. Yep. Is he suggesting that unless 100% of Canadians are vaccinated, he's not even going to consider opening up and lifting restrictions? Yeah. Is that what he's trying to tell us? 90% is good for us, and I would say other countries in the world who have less vaccine uptake. Is he saying he's not going to do anything until 100% of Canadians are vaccinated? Really?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, not only are Canadians tired of this pandemic, of the challenges we're facing, but they are also, of course, tired of the restrictions, tired of the rules, tired of the lockdowns. That is understandable. But you know what helps lift restrictions? You know what helps move beyond lockdowns? Vaccinations. When Canadians get vaccinated, including with our vaccine mandates that ensure the federal public service and anyone getting on planes or trains are vaccinated, that has helped move forward, keep Canadians safe, and most importantly, to keep our frontline health workers who've been heroes during this pandemic from being overwhelmed.
The honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, I didn't hear an answer from the Prime Minister. Canada has one of the highest vaccination rates in the world. Over 90% are vaccinated, as the Prime Minister has said himself. Does the Prime Minister expect 100% of Canadians to be vaccinated, to start to think about presenting a reopening plan for our economy and for ending extreme measures? The question is clear. Is that the Prime Minister's objective, to wait for 100% of Canadians to be vaccinated to start giving people hope again? Yes or no? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the Conservative Party of Canada has spent the past 2 weeks approving and encouraging these protests across Canada. The Conservatives were their biggest spokespeople. They even helped to fundraise for these blockades, and this has had a disastrous impact. Our jobs, our businesses, blockades in communities have hurt families, and I hope that the Conservative Party will continue with their current position today and continue to call for an end to these blockades. The honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I hope that the Prime Minister won't hide away once again like he did for the past 2 weeks, and he will be present so that he can speak and listen and make sure that we can end these protests. We want these to end. We want the end of these protests to end, but we want him to commit to presenting a plan to Canadians. We want this Prime Minister make sure that all levels of government here in Canada present a reopening plan to the population. How come he is still refusing to listen to Canadians and to present a plan and to give Canadians a bit of hope? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy to hear the honourable member to condemn and calling for an end of the blockades today in this House, and I hope he will be able to convince his colleagues at the Conservative Party as well to stop supporting and encouraging these blockades and these protesters that are hurting businesses, jobs, and supply chains, and they're also hurting Canadians who live in these communities across the country. These blockades have to end. The Conservative Party has to be clear on that. The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I asked the Prime Minister for a meeting. The leader of the official opposition asked the party leaders to meet. Given the troubling developments in Ottawa and across Canada right now, there are significant economic impacts and impacts for our public health and also growing public security issues. Can the Prime Minister call the party leaders together to a meeting, an emergency meeting? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Inaudible for the interpreter. I am in close contact with our partners at various levels of government. We're having conversations with other parliamentarians, and I'm very happy to hear the leader of the Bloc to give him a briefing on the situation that people are facing right now here in Ottawa and across the country. We are going to continue to remain focused on the end of these blockades and on the work we have to do to protect our economy and to support our communities across the country. The member for Belleuil-Chambly. The briefing that I would like to hear from, I would like to hear from all of the other leaders. There is obstructions taking place at the 911 call center. There are also obstructions at the Ottawa airport, and things are growing increasingly difficult. A friend of my father's said, we couldn't put out the fire. Can the Prime Minister put out this fire? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, this government is taking action every day to reduce our impact, the impact of these blockades on the economy. We are here working with the Ontario government, with whom I spoke a great deal last night, and we're going to continue to do the work needed to make sure that Canadians from across this country are not bothered or affected by these blockades that are illegal.
For Burnaby South.
Mr. Speaker, we're in the second week of the siege in Ottawa. We've got borders that are shut down across the country, including Coutts and the Ambassador Bridge. This is hurting workers, truckers, small businesses, and families. We've got a Prime Minister who's more focused on debating whose jurisdiction it is. Clearly, making sure our borders are open is a responsibility of the federal government. So will the Prime Minister stop hiding behind jurisdiction and fix this mess?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, from the very beginning, we have been there to support all levels of government and the work they needed to do.
I'd like the Prime Minister to start over. They were applauding so much for his answer, I mean, they couldn't hear it. The Right Honourable Prime Minister, please go ahead.
Mr. Speaker, from the very beginning of this crisis around blockades in Ottawa and elsewhere, we've been working closely with partners on the ground. We've been furnishing resources. We've been furnishing RCMP officers. We've been furnishing tactical supports as we move forward through this. We understand how important it is to put an end to these barricades. We understand how important it is for people to get their lives back, to be able to get their livelihoods back. That's why we're calling upon the Conservative Party that has for the past 2 weeks been enabling, supporting, and cheering on these blockades to stay consistent in saying that they have to end, that we have to get our lives back, all of us as Canadians.
Hear it, hear it.
The honourable member for Burnaby South. This is the second week of the siege in Ottawa, and we have borders across the country that are blocked by these convoy protests. Instead of solving issues that are affecting all workers, Canadians, and truckers, we have a Prime Minister that wants to debate jurisdiction. It's clear there's no debate here. There's federal work to be done to make sure that our borders are working. So, will the Prime Minister stop debating jurisdiction and solve this issue? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, since the beginning of this crisis, we've worked hand in hand with various jurisdictions by offering the necessary resources, whether it's in terms of RCMP officers or technical supports. We're going to continue to respect jurisdiction, but to be there at every stage to do everything that's needed to end these blockades. Unfortunately, we can't say the same thing for the Conservatives. Over the past 2 weeks, they have been encouraging and applauding these blockades and even making calls for funding for them. It is time for this to end because it's hurting Canadians.
Member for Calgary-Midnapore.
Mr. Speaker, this Liberal government continues to use vaccines as a political weapon rather than a tool. Unlike other governments, they can't seem to figure out how to move forward. We don't need more job vacancies or supply chain issues. Canada and Canadians need to get back to normal. Instead of creating new vaccine mandates for federally regulated workplaces, will this minister listen to the science and his MPs and move towards lifting these mandates?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm so pleased to answer to this question speaking about vaccination. The Prime Minister mentioned just a moment ago that 80% of Canadians of all ages have received their full doses. Now, about 10,000 every day more Canadians are getting their first vaccine. 55% have received a booster dose. Every day, 180,000 people in Canada receive a booster dose. And we have approximately 50% of children between 5 and 11 being vaccinated. About 6,000 of them every day receive their first dose.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, 98% of federal employees have received at least one dose of the vaccine. Even PHAC has confirmed that it's time to reevaluate existing measures and not blindly keep current restrictions. Does the minister agree with the recommendation from Dr. Kam, or does he prefer to ignore science? The Honourable Minister of Health. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. She is so right for congratulating 98% of the public service that is vaccinated. Vaccination, Mr. Speaker, is not a punishment. It is protection. So when you get vaccinated, you're protecting yourself, your work colleagues, your family, your children, your community, your friends. It's not a punishment, Mr. Speaker. In fact, the only way to get through this current wave and all the other variants and in the coming years and weeks, that's the only way.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians have been misled. Our travel restrictions are not symmetrical with the United States. Our requirements for an arrival PCR test is the only one in the G7, and the minister knows that. PCR arrivals testing is wasteful, it's punitive, and it's ineffective. Canadians want to know, what day will this government drop these ineffective and costly travel restrictions?
The Honourable Minister of Transport.
Mr. Speaker, Speaking of science, I want to remind every member of this House that we are still in a pandemic. We still have thousands of people in hospitals. We still have thousands of surgeries being cancelled. So we will follow the science, Mr. Speaker, and as conditions change, we will change our regulations and we will change our rules. But we cannot take advice from a Conservative Party that hasn't even been able to convince Canadians of vaccination. We will take advice from scientists and from our public health workers.
Well, member for Thornhill.
Mr. Speaker, can somebody update the minister's talking points? Across the country, provincial governments are listening and they are presenting plans. The Chief Public Health Officer of Canada, as well as provincial health officers, have all said it's time. 90% of Canadians are vaccinated, so I'm asking the Prime Minister when he will stop traumatizing Canadians and give us a plan to live our lives with COVID. What is the threshold? What day will he lift the restrictions?
The Honourable Minister.
Again, Mr. Speaker, I want to bring my colleague back to earth. We are in the middle of a pandemic. We have thousands of people in hospitals. We have surgeries being cancelled. We will adjust our measures as the circumstances change. And the way we change our measures is by listening to scientists, by listening to experts.
I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing the response. The noise is just too high. So I'm going to ask the Minister to start again so I can hear the full answer. The Honourable Minister of Transport, please.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians understand that we all need to follow science to protect our loved ones and to protect our healthcare workers. Canadians will do whatever it takes to protect their loved one. I can assure you, Mr. Speaker, our government will do what is needed to protect our health and to protect our economy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Good job. The Honourable Member for Essex.
Mr. Speaker, diapers, baby food, groceries, fresh produce, manufacturing, and our auto sector are at risk. The Essex-Windsor border brings the necessities of life to Canadians. It can also bring our country to its knees, Mr. Speaker. We must have open, honest dialogue with Canadians. My bags are packed. Will the Prime Minister commit right now to fly with me to Windsor and then to Washington to give Canadians their lives back by ending the mandates once and for all?
Honourable Minister of Transport.
Speaker, speaking of honest dialogue, can we be honest here where the Conservative Party for the last 2 weeks have been justifying blockades and protests, for the last 2 weeks have been absolving the responsibility of lawbreakers and cutting our supply chains. Mr. Speaker, we will stand firm. These blockades are illegal. They must end today. They're having an impact on our economy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Lambton Kent, Middlesex.
Speaker, traffic over the Blue Water Bridge, which is a direct link to my riding of Lambton Kent Middlesex, is backed up because this Liberal government won't lift the mandates. Our Prime Minister's divisive words only add fuel to the fire and encourage the blockades. There's tractors parked out on the 401 right now. The Prime Minister is doing nothing to stop the division he's created and to give hope to our nation that is beautiful but weary. Mr. Speaker, what is the Prime Minister doing today to end the mandates and restore Canada's supply chains?
The Honourable Minister of Transport.
Mr. Speaker, speaking of flaming and fueling the fire, these Conservatives for 2 weeks have been providing excuses for lawbreakers, have been providing justification for saying people are above the law. They may have changed their leader, but they continue to flip-flop, Mr. Speaker. This Conservative Party must condemn blockades and call on all of them to go home so we can restore order in our supply chain.
Mr. Speaker, Russia supplies almost half of Europe's gas. President Putin has threatened to cut off those gas supplies if Europe comes to Ukraine's defense. People will freeze, industry will shutter, Europe's economy will grind to a halt. President Biden has been rallying natural gas producing countries around the world to secure additional supplies in the event that happens. Can the government explain to this House why Canada, the world's 5th largest natural gas producer, cannot export liquefied natural gas from our east coast to assist our European allies.
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, conversations with your European allies and Americans are happening, and we're coordinating our response. And we know that any further invasion by Russia of Ukraine will make sure that there is met with severe sanctions. And we will always find a way to help our allies. My colleague, Minister of Natural Resources, and myself, and many other cabinet ministers are involved in this question. Thank you.
The honourable member for Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Putin is inching closer and closer to invading Ukraine with every passing day. But this Liberal government is ignoring their pleas for help to fend off the attack. Ukraine doesn't need our binoculars, it needs our RadarSat images. Yes. You know, what good was it to send scopes for rifles without actually sending them the rifles to put the scopes on? So I ask, why is the Foreign Affairs Minister abandoning our friends and allies in Ukraine and saying, no, you're on your own?
Honourable Minister.
It's not because my colleague talks about Ukraine that necessarily the Ukrainian government agrees with what he's saying. I think he should look at what President Zelensky, President of Ukraine, Foreign Minister of Ukraine, Dmytro Kuleba, mentioned and said thank you to Canada for deterrence measures, including a $120 million loan and also extending and expanding Operation Unifier. On our side, on the diplomatic side, we're actively engaged, and we will make sure that all deterrence measures are in place to make sure that there's no further invasion of Ukraine.
The honourable member for Charleswood St. James, Assiniboia Headingley.
Mr. Speaker, in a disturbing development, last week, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping met and jointly called on NATO to rule out expansion in Eastern Europe, denounced the new security formation in the Asia-Pacific region, and criticized the AUKUS Trilateral Pact, all three fundamental to the rules-based international order. Given Russia's aggressive posture on Ukraine and Xi's on Taiwan, can the minister advise on what date specific sanctions will be used to combat this new and very, very troubling alliance?
The honourable minister.
Thank you to my colleague for this important question, because we both agree that it's extremely important that strong economic sanctions be imposed should there be a further invasion of Ukraine. And so I wanted to make sure that he understands that we're ready to impose these sanctions. And meanwhile, we're working in lockstep with our allies to make sure that we have a maximum impact with, obviously, the United States, the UK, but also with our EU partners.
Over the past 2 years, Canadians have relied on the news more than ever for updates, health guidance, and accurate information. But now members of the media are being targeted by convoys, experiencing harassment and even death threats while they work hard to keep Canadians informed. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister has been practically silent. Yesterday, CTV Edmonton said that they will no longer display logos on their vehicles in order to protect their staff. What is the government doing to protect members of the media who are so vital to Canadians and to our democracy?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
And first of all, I want to echo the concerns that were expressed by my colleague. I hope all members would join in condemning any kind of intimidation, violence, or hate expressed towards the media, who play a fundamental role in reporting on current events, Mr. Speaker. And, right now, Mr. Speaker, it is important more than ever to ensure that the Canadian public are informed about the ways in which we are going to get out of this pandemic, which means peacefully, respectfully, and by getting vaccinated, Mr. Speaker. And I just hope that the Conservatives would finally join us in asking the members of the convoy to go home. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I'll quote an email to the government sent by the Liberal MP for Thunder Bay Rainy River at the height of the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. Quote, I hate to tell you, but everyone on the ground considers our government's management of this, that it amounts so far to a total disaster, unquote. Afghanistan committee testimony indicates nothing has changed. Quote, at this time, it is not coming across that Afghanistan is a priority foreign policy issue for Canada. A Canadian moral stance is missing. Unquote. Mr. Speaker, why are the Liberal ministers failing to show leadership and accountability in dealing with this urgent humanitarian aid crisis?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our Canadian Armed Forces did everything we asked of them under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Canada was part of an air bridge with our allies that saved as many people as we could. Our armed forces worked around the clock to evacuate as many people as possible for as long as conditions permitted, including our former interpreters and local staff and citizens of allied countries. Under the leadership of my colleague, the Minister of Immigration, we are committed to bringing 40,000 Afghan refugees to Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Edmonton West.
Mr. Speaker, it wasn't enough for the Liberals when they paid out $9 million in CERB benefits to dead people last year. It's now been revealed that they've paid out $12 million in CERB to people abroad. Now, surely even this government realizes it's the CERB, not the oversee ERB. Will the minister guarantee to apologize to Canadians for this waste of taxpayers' money, stand and commit that they will recover every penny of these wasted funds?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what we won't apologize for, in fact, we're extremely proud of, is having helped over 8 million Canadians who received the CERB when they needed it most at the beginning of this pandemic. Absolutely, Mr. Speaker, verifications are ongoing to identify individuals who received the CERB but may not be eligible, and claimants who are found to have received the benefit improperly will be required to reimburse the payment. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Lévis-Lobinière. Mr. Speaker, official House documents report that 1,610 people received CERB at addresses abroad, outside Canada. This was supposed to be a Canadian emergency benefit, not an international emergency benefit. No one inside this government did something to avoid losing these $11.9 million. This is yet another scandal. Mr. Speaker, is there a vaccine against Liberal incompetence?
L'Honorable Ministre.
Mr. Speaker, when Canadians really needed support, we acted quickly to bring forward the CERB. Now, the CERB does require that the person reside in Canada, but occasionally it has occurred that beneficiaries worked in Canada while having a postal address abroad. For example, people working in Canada under the Temporary Foreign Workers Program, or people with permanent residency. Now, if people in this situation had met all the other requirements, they could receive the benefit.
Mr. Speaker, we know the Ottawa blockade isn't about truckers. 90% of truckers are vaccinated, and they continue to play a vital role in keeping our economy running. Despite that, for the second week in a row, the residents of Ottawa have been forced to put up with unacceptable occupation, keeping local businesses closed and residents from being able to live their normal lives. Can the Minister of Public Safety provide an update to this House on the support our government is providing to help get life for the residents of Ontario back to normal? Thank you.
Minister.
I want to thank My colleague for the question, Mr. Speaker, and I hope all members will express solidarity with the people of Ottawa who've experienced grave disruption. People can't get to work, families can't drop off their kids to daycare, seniors can't get around. It's absolutely unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. That's why the government has worked to ensure that police have all of the resources that they need, and I'm pleased to report to members in this chamber that we've now provided 2 installments of additional resources of the RCMP. Mr. Speaker, our top priority on this side of the House is to ensure that the illegal blockades end, that we uphold the law, and that we ensure that people can get back to their lives, and I hope the Conservatives will join us in that. Thanks very much.